The Queth exclusion zone was a bureaucratic fiction, and everyone in fleet signals knew it. What the zone actually was, stripped of the diplomatic language layered over it in the 7 years since the Conclave's first automated buoys appeared at the edge of the Verath corridor, was a statement of ownership. It said, "We were here first." It said, "What passes through passes on our terms." It said, in the particular idiom of a civilization that had long since offloaded its moral reasoning to a distributed lattice of recursive processors, "We have classified you, and you have not yet classified us, and that asymmetry is the whole of our advantage." I had been listening to the exclusion zone for 14 months when the transmission came. My name is Marin Solis. I held the rank of Petty Officer First Class in the Terran Fleet Signals Corps, and I had been posted to the stealth cruiser TFSN Ardennes for 22 of my 31 years of life. That is not a typo. The Ardennes runs a cold ship posting, minimal crew rotation, maximum operational continuity, and I had enlisted at 9 as a signals apprentice through the Corps Junior Track program. By the time I was old enough to vote, I had already logged more deep space intercept hours than most senior analysts ashore, and by the time the transmission came, I was the kind of person who hears a carrier wave the way other people hear weather. Not as an event, but as information, layered and specific, telling you something about the system that generated it before you have read a single word it carries. The Ardennes was a Halcyon-class stealth cruiser, which is to say it was not a warship in any conventional sense. It was approximately 430 meters of suppressed electromagnetic signature wrapped around a signal suite that would have embarrassed most planetary listening stations. Its hull was coated in a layered ablative dampener that drank radar and sonar return and converted them to a thermal bleed so attenuated you would need a detector the size of a small moon to catch it at operational distance. The hull was dark gray, without markings visible at distance, without the running lights most ships keep lit as a matter of basic courtesy to other traffic in the lane. There was no other traffic in the lane. We were 42 light minutes inside a zone that no Terran vessel was officially supposed to be in, and we had been running cold for 3 weeks. We ran cold. We ran quiet. We did not engage. We listened and we recorded, and we transmitted our records via tight beam relay drone to Fleet Command at the corridor's outer edge, and we kept our mouths shut. That was the job. I was good at it. The signals bay of the Ardennes occupied a pressurized volume roughly 12 meters by 8 in the forward section of the primary hull, aft of the command deck, and forward of the crew berthing. It was not a comfortable space. The overhead clearance was 1.9 meters, which was fine for me and miserable for the 3 analysts on my watch who averaged 1.85 and spent their careers with their shoulders rounded and their necks canted. The lighting was dim and blue shifted at all hours because we ran the bay on night cycle illumination continuously. It reduces fatigue in prolonged passive intercept operations, which was the kind of thing you either learned to live with or left signals for a posting with Windows. I had never wanted a posting with Windows. There were 5 stations in the bay, arranged in a shallow arc facing the main display, mine at the center left, with the deep syntax translation matrix interface built into the primary console, and 4 others for the analysis team rotating through watch. Lieutenant Commander Ashab Pren held the signals officer billet and ran the bay when she was not sleeping. When she was sleeping, I held the bay. That was most hours. We had been sitting at approximately 42 light minutes, inside the zone's outer marker for 22 days, when the automated buoy at waypoint Keller 7 went active. Keller 7 was not supposed to go active. It was a passive node, one of 11 we had seeded along the zone's inner boundary over the preceding months, each one a receiver only, no transmitter, no power signature above background. They were the reason the Ardennes had spent 4 years making periodic approaches into the corridor before this posting, not to listen itself, but to lay the infrastructure for listening. 11 nodes, precisely placed, calibrated to catch specific frequencies on the Queth's contact management spectrum, and relay them tight beam to us at a signal intensity that would not register on anything outside the immediate relay chain. What activated Keller 7 was a carrier wave. A very specific carrier wave on a frequency the Queth used exclusively for what their taxonomy files designated as first contact protocol events. We had seen that frequency exactly twice before, both times in retrospective intercepts from the Sarath system, recordings made by alien historians, not by us, of what had happened when the Queth made contact with species the Conclave subsequently absorbed into its administrative structure. In both cases, the frequency had preceded full integration by approximately 8 months. The first contact protocol, the Sarath recordings showed, was not a long process. The Queth were efficient. Pren pulled up the frequency profile on the main display and did not say anything for a moment. She had the stillness of someone who has been doing this long enough to know that reacting to information before you have processed it is a waste of time. "That's the welcome frequency," I said. "Yes. They know we're here." That is one interpretation. The other interpretation was that they had been running the welcome protocol on a broadcast schedule in all directions, and we had simply crossed the threshold of its effective range. That was plausible. The Queth were documented to run automated contact management on predictive schedules rather than waiting for confirmed detection. It was more efficient from a lattice processing standpoint. You seeded the welcome signal at intervals in all directions simultaneously and let any sufficiently radio-detectable civilization catch it on its own. The signal did the work. The lattice did not need to be specifically involved until after reception was confirmed. The problem with that interpretation was that the carrier wave was directional. It was aimed at us. I sat down at my station and pulled up the intercept as it continued to resolve on the secondary display. The signal was structured in 3 layers, identical in architecture to both the Sarath recordings, which told me 2 things. First, that the Queth had not materially altered their first contact protocol in at least 30 years. And second, that what I was about to look at was the same thing that had preceded the absorption of 2 spacefaring species into the Conclave's administrative structure, and that if the pattern held, what happened next would not be pleasant. The outer layer was calibration data, frequency tables, mathematical constants, a sequence of prime numbers formatted as pulse intervals. Standard first contact architecture, universal enough that we had cracked it from the Sarath recordings within a week. The middle layer was syntactic, compressed grammar tables designed to give a receiving civilization the scaffolding to parse the inner layer. Also standard, also cracked. The inner layer was what mattered. The inner layer was what the outer 2 were there to prepare you to receive. I had read everything Fleet Xenolinguistics had on the Sarath recordings. I had read the analysis reports, the dissenting analyses, the technical annexes, and a classified addendum that I was not technically cleared to access, but which Pren had shared with me at the start of the posting on the grounds that I was going to be the person running the translation matrix if the moment came, and a person running the translation matrix needed to know everything the matrix was going to encounter. In both Sarath cases, the receiving species had parsed the outer and middle layers successfully. Both were spacefaring. Both were radio-capable. Both had functional translation infrastructure. In both cases, the xenolinguists had noted something odd about the inner layer. It did not match the grammar tables in the middle layer. The grammar tables, when parsed, produced a clean formal language, regular, unambiguous, suitable for information exchange. The inner layer was not in that language. It was in something else, something that the middle layer grammar did not account for and did not scaffold toward. The conclusion in the Sarath files was that the inner layer was encrypted or compressed in a format that exceeded the analytical capacity of 2 relatively young spacefaring civilizations to crack. I had written a comment on that conclusion in my private margin notes 14 months ago, when I first read the files. The comment was, or the inner layer is not meant to be parsed consciously. Pren was reading the incoming data over my shoulder. I could hear her breathing slow and even, the way it always was when she was concentrating. Standard outer layer, she said. Yes. Standard middle layer structure. Same prime interval calibration as the Sareth intercepts. Yes. She paused. The inner layer is coming through differently. I was already looking at it. The inner layer in the Sareth recordings had been dense and non-repeating, with a fractal recursion signature that xenolinguistics had flagged as possibly generative. The idea that it was not a fixed message, but a template that produced different output depending on the characteristics of the receiving medium, adjusting itself to the specific cognitive architecture it was working with. What I was looking at now had the same fractal base signature, but it had also been modified in ways that were not subtle if you were looking at the deep syntax architecture. The core grammar was the same. The recursive depth had been increased. The branching coefficient, the rate at which the recursive structure divided into parallel processing threads, had been widened by a factor I estimated at roughly 3, though the matrix would give me a precise number once it finished its intake sweep. The Ardennes' deep syntax translation matrix was the reason for the posting. It was the reason a 400-meter cold hull signals ship with a crew of 63 had been sitting inside a sovereign exclusion zone at extraordinary diplomatic and legal risk for 22 consecutive months. The matrix was, to the best of Fleet's publicly acknowledged knowledge, the most sophisticated xenolinguistic processing architecture a human organization had ever built. It had been developed over 11 years by a team of computational linguists, cognitive architects, and signals engineers whose names were not in any file I had access to, and it did not translate languages. Languages were the easy part. What the matrix did was map the structural topology of a signal, the shape of its grammar, the depth of its recursion, the relationship between its component layers, and render that topology as a mathematical object that human analysts could then study. It was a microscope, not a dictionary. It had been built specifically because of the Sareth recordings, specifically because of the margin note. Because someone at Fleet, someone with more clearance than I had and more patience than most, had read the same recordings I had and come to the same conclusion, and then spent 11 years and considerable resources building a system that could look at the inner layer without being subject to it. I ran the incoming signal through the matrix. The outer and middle layers resolved immediately. Prime interval calibration locked within 4 seconds. Grammar tables parsed clean. The matrix produced a structural map of the middle layer that matched the Sareth profile exactly, which was expected. The outer and middle layers were not the point. They were the delivery mechanism. They were the box that the inner layer was shipped in, the casing that made the package look like a gift. The inner layer took longer. The matrix worked on it for 11 minutes and 23 seconds. I have the log time down to the second because I checked it afterwards when I was writing my notes, and because those 11 minutes were the ones I remember most clearly from the entire contact event. I sat at my station and watched the progress indicator and did not speak, and did not adjust my station lighting, and did not reach for my coffee because I did not want to break whatever quiet thing was happening in the processing core. The matrix's processing activity was visible on my secondary display as a series of topological transformation operations. The system was rotating the signal's grammar structure in a high-dimensional space, looking for the axes along which the recursion made sense. It was slow work. Slow and methodical and patient, the way the ship was patient, the way the whole posting had been patient. Pren had gone back to her station. 2 of the other analysts on the watch were pretending to read their own intercepts. Analyst Tercio had his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and had not moved it for 4 minutes. Everyone in the bay could see what the matrix was doing on the main display. Everyone was very still. The structural map of the inner layer resolved at 3:47 ship time. I looked at it for a long time. The matrix rendered structural topologies as a kind of cartography, a surface with peaks and valleys, recursive structures that folded back on themselves in patterns that had meaning if you knew how to read the notation. I had spent 11 years learning to read the notation. I had seen topologies that corresponded to encryption schemas, to compressed scientific data, to simple broadcast identifiers that alien species used to mark territorial boundaries. I had never seen a topology that looked like this one. Then I said very quietly, "Lieutenant Commander." Pren crossed the bay in 4 steps. She looked at the display. She looked at it for almost as long as I had, and she had less training in the Matrix's notation than I did, which meant it took her longer to see what I was seeing, and when she saw it, her expression did not change the way most people's expressions change. It simply settled. It went very calm and very still. The inner layer was not a message. That was the first thing, and it was the most important thing, and it was the thing I spent the most time trying to find the right words for when I wrote my notes later. A message tells you something. A message is propositional, it makes assertions, it conveys information, it says here is a fact I am transmitting to you, and you receive it and integrate it and it changes what you know. The inner layer did none of that. It had no propositional content, no assertions, no greetings, no territorial claims, no information in the communicative sense. What it did instead was structural. It was a grammar of grammar, a set of rules, very deep rules, operating at a level well below conscious linguistic processing, that, if absorbed into a sufficiently complex linguistic processing system, would quietly and recursively, and without any singular detectable moment of change, alter the way that system processed certain categories of distinction. The matrix had mapped which categories the inner layer targeted. The rendering took the form of a set of topological markers in the output notation, each one corresponding to a cognitive architecture function that the xenolinguistics team had previously cataloged in the Sareth analysis. I read them carefully, in order, the way I always read matrix output slowly, with the analytical habit of someone who knows that precision matters more than speed. In-group versus out-group assessment. The way a mind draws the boundary between entities it considers part of itself and entities it considers other. Threat assessment weighting for entities classified as other. The discount rate, effectively, how much less weight a mind gives to the concerns and interests of entities it has categorized as outside its in-group. The threshold parameters for cooperative behavior toward non-kin entities. The line at which a mind decides that cooperation with a stranger is natural and obvious, rather than a concession requiring justification. The baseline resistance to instruction from an authoritative external source. The default level of pushback, the internal friction that makes a mind say yes, but or wait, let me think about that, rather than simply yes. It was not a weapon. I want to be precise about that because the word weapon implies violence and the inner layer was not violent. It did not cause pain. It did not destroy. What it had caused in both the Sareth species, and almost certainly in every other species, the Conclave had made contact with over their 3,000-year history, was a very gentle, very thorough, very precisely targeted restructuring of how a receiving mind decided who was us and who was them, and what us owed them, and how much pushback was appropriate when them gave instructions. It made you more cooperative. It reduced your categorical resistance. It lowered the wall between what felt like your own reasoning and what felt like reasonable guidance from an external source. And it did not do this in any way you could feel, because it worked at the level of the grammar your mind used to generate its values, not at the level of the values themselves. You would not wake up one morning and think, something is different. You would simply find, over the weeks and months following contact, that the Queth's proposals seemed more reasonable than you had expected. that your resistance to their administrative structures felt somehow excessive, somehow the product of a parochialism you were embarrassed to have displayed, that the concerns of your own species about sovereignty felt smaller than they had before, and the conclave's logic, vast and patient and internally consistent, felt larger. You would cooperate, because cooperating would feel correct. Every species that had received the welcome transmission had cooperated. I sat at my station in the signals bay of the TFSN Ardennes, 42 light minutes inside a sovereign exclusion zone, in a cold-hull ship that had been specifically designed and crewed and positioned to intercept exactly this signal. And I looked at what the translation matrix had rendered for me, and I understood something I had not quite allowed myself to know before that moment. Fleet had known what the inner layer was. Not the full architecture. That was new. The matrix had gone further than any prior analysis. But the basic function. Someone at the command level had known or very strongly suspected that the Queth welcome transmission was not a greeting in any conventional sense. They had built the Ardennes' translation matrix specifically to receive the signal without being changed by it. They had sent us into this zone as an interception platform, not a warship, not a diplomatic vessel, but a receiver precisely engineered to neutralize the one capability the Queth had relied on to manage every contact in their long and patient history of absorbing civilizations. We had been positioned to be first contact, not to be surprised by first contact, not to stumble into it the way the Sareth species had, to conduct it deliberately, prepared, with a system between us and the signal that could show us exactly what the signal was without letting the signal do what it was designed to do. Someone had planned this for a very long time. I need to log a Class 1 event flag, I said. Already done, Prince said. Captain's on her way. Commander Yelena Brast arrived in the signals bay 6 minutes later. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair she kept cropped close to her skull, and she had been commanding the Ardennes for 11 years, which made her the single person in fleet with the most continuous experience of this posting. She did not say anything when she came through the hatch. She walked to my station and read the matrix output, and then she stood straight and put her hands behind her back and looked at the display with an expression that I can only describe as recognition, not surprise, but the particular look of someone seeing something arrive that they have been waiting for without knowing when it would come. How confident are you in the topology map? She said. Hi, the matrix flagged no ambiguity above threshold on any of the targeted categories. The recursive architecture is clean and internally consistent. The Sareth calibration baseline matches at 94%. The 4% variance is the expanded branching coefficient, which is a real structural difference, not a parsing artifact. What would it have done to us if we'd received it directly? No matrix. The outer and middle layers would have done nothing. Their calibration and scaffolding. The inner layer, I stopped for a moment because I wanted to be precise, and precision required that I not soften what I was saying. The inner layer is designed to operate on any sufficiently complex language processing system. Humans qualify. The cognitive architecture it targets is present in human neurology, the same categorical processing functions, the same in-group out-group assessment mechanisms, the same threshold parameters for cooperative behavior. The effect would be gradual and would not announce itself. Over weeks, you would find the Queth's reasoning more persuasive than your initial assessment had suggested. You would find your own concerns about their intentions less urgent. You would be more receptive to their administrative proposals. And we would eventually cooperate. Every prior species did. Brast looked at the display. The matrix output was still live on the main screen. The structural topology of the inner layer rendered in the notation like the cross-section of something organic, symmetrical, recursive, purposeful in the way that biological systems are purposeful, shaped by long selection pressure toward a specific function. What is it doing right now? She said. Is the signal still active? I checked. Yes, carrier is active on the first contact frequency. The inner layer is cycling, repeating with minor parameter variation in the recursion structure. The matrix flags the variation as consistent with self-adjustment. The signal is probably modifying itself in response to receiver characteristics, most likely using return signal traffic to calibrate. Is it getting return signal from us? Not from us. Keller 7 is a passive receiver. It recorded and relayed but did not emit. No response has gone out from the Ardennes. We're cold. I paused, thinking through the implication. The signal may be adjusting on an assumption. Most spacefaring species at our apparent detection level run continuous communications traffic that is detectable as background emission even when not directed at the signal source. We're not emitting that background. The signal may be interpreting our silence as a parsing failure, a species that received the outer layer but couldn't decode the middle layer. That might be why it's cycling. It's trying to find a parameter set that reaches us. And it can't reach us because we don't have the vulnerability it's looking for. The matrix intercepted it, not our neurology. Yes. Brass turned from the display and looked at me directly. It was the look she used when she wanted an assessment, not a summary, when she wanted to know what I actually thought rather than what the log said. Recommendations, she said. It was not a question I had been asked before in that context. I am an analyst. I intercept and record. I translate. I annotate. I do not typically make recommendations about what to do with what I have translated, because that is above my pay grade in every institutional sense of the phrase. But she had asked, and she had asked me specifically rather than Pren, and I understood why. I had been inside this material for 14 months. I had built the context. I knew what I was looking at. I thought about what I knew. The Queth Conclave had been conducting first contact events for 3,000 years. 3,000 years is not an abstraction. It is longer than the gap between now and the earliest Terran civilizations that left written records. In that time they had absorbed, through the mechanism I had just mapped, every species they had ever contacted. Not through war, not through coercion that the receiving species would have recognized as coercion. Through the welcome transmission, and the patient administrative process that followed, and the quiet cognitive restructuring that made every step of that process feel reasonable to the receiving mind from the inside. We were the first receiving species that had built something to stand between the signal and the mind. That was what the Ardennes was. That was what the Matrix was. That was what 14 months of cold posting inside an exclusion zone was. We were the first to be in a position to read the inner layer rather than be read by it. I recommend we respond, I said, not with a counter-transmission, not with weapons, with the Matrix output. I looked at Brass steadily. We send them the topology map. We send them what the Matrix produced, the structural rendering of the inner layer, formatted as data rather than as active signal, in their own mathematical notation. We transmit it on the first contact frequency. We tell them, in the most precise possible terms, that we received the inner layer, that we interpreted it, and that we did not process it the way it was designed to be processed. Brass was quiet. We'd be showing our hand, she said. They'd know we have the Matrix, or something like it. They'd know we have something that did what the Matrix did, I said. Whether they know exactly what that something is, they'd have to infer. What they would know for certain is that the handshake didn't take. Why not simply hold position, stay cold? Relay the full intercept to command, and let them make the call. Because if we relay this and command decides to sit on it while it goes through the policy chain, the Queth will eventually detect us through other means, or they will make first contact with a crewed vessel that doesn't have the Matrix. That vessel's crew will receive the welcome transmission directly. They will be changed by it. And the negotiating position we are sitting in right now, the only position from which this conversation can be had honestly, will not exist again. I paused. We are the first species in 3,000 years in a position to read this. If we spend that position on committee meetings, it will not come back." The bay was very still. The atmospheric processors ran at low cycle when we were cold, and I could hear them clearly, a faint mechanical breath in the background behind the hum of the matrix. Brass said, "Walk me through the mechanics." I prepare a response package, the matrix topology output, annotated, formatted as data rather than as signal, so it reads as analysis, not as countertransmission. I attach a header in the outer layer grammar from their own middle layer scaffold, so it's decodable on their end. I transmit on the first contact frequency, directed type beam at the nearest Queth relay node. We break stealth for the duration of the transmission window. I estimate 30 to 60 seconds depending on final package size, and then we go cold again. And for 30 to 60 seconds, they know exactly where we are. "Yes. What's your read on the risk?" I thought about the Soreth recordings. I thought about a civilization that had never needed to use anything other than the welcome transmission in 3,000 years of contact events. I thought about what a hyper-rational distributed reasoning lattice does when it encounters the first data point in 3,000 years that does not fit its model. It stops. It recalibrates. It does not act until it has produced a revised classification. That is the thing about a hyper-rational system. It is not impulsive. Impulse requires a certain inefficiency, a willingness to act on partial information. The Queth lattice does not have that inefficiency. It is thorough. It does not proceed without a classification. "I think they will stop," I said. "I think the lattice will need to reclassify us before it can produce a new action recommendation. Reclassification of a contact event outside all prior parameters will take significant processing time. I think what we gain in that time, the channel, the conversation, the position, is more than what we lose in 60 seconds of position exposure." Brass looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she looked at Pren, who gave a very small nod. "Prepare the package," she said. I prepared the package. It took me 41 minutes. The matrix output was dense and I wanted it to be legible, not just accurate. I wanted it to be undeniable. Legibility required formatting, and formatting in the Queth notation required me to work from the xenolinguistics files coverage of their symbolic systems, which were not natural but constructed, and therefore regular, and therefore, if you knew the base grammar well enough, comprehensible in both directions. Their mathematical notation was built on the same formal logic as ours, derived from the same universal regularities. That made it translatable in a way that their linguistic conventions were not. I formatted the topology map in their notation, walking through each of the targeted cognitive categories in the order the matrix had rendered them, showing the recursive structure of each, showing the mechanism. I wanted it to read not as an accusation but as an analysis, the same tone you would use to return someone's letter to them annotated to say, "I read this, and I understood it, and here is what it says." I prefaced the topology map with the greeting calibration sequence from the outer layer of their own signal, so the package opened in a register they would recognize. The outer layer was a handshake of its own, a mathematical handshake, clean and unambiguous, saying only, "Here is who I am in terms you understand." Then the topology map. Then, at the end, a short data block in the middle layer grammar that said, as precisely as I could render it in a language architecture that lacked a first-person singular pronoun as a discrete grammatical unit, this structure was received. This structure was interpreted as data. This structure did not produce the effect for which it was designed. That was all. No threats, no claims. No statement of intention beyond the one already implicit in the act of sending the response. We read it, and we read it clearly, and we are telling you so. Pren reviewed the package. Brast reviewed the package. Neither of them suggested changes. Brast authorized the transmission at 5:09 ship time, and at 5:12 the TFSN Ardennes came out of cold running for exactly 53 seconds, transmitted the package tight beam to the nearest Queth relay node at approximately 18 light-minutes distance, and went cold again. Then we waited. The waiting was the part I remember most clearly in the long run, not the analysis, not the preparation of the package. The waiting, because the waiting had a texture that the other parts didn't. We were cold and silent, and the bay was dim, and the matrix was idle, and there was nothing to do but track the carrier wave on the first contact frequency and watch for any change in the Queth relay network's emission patterns and wait. We ran full passive intercept throughout, the same sweep routine we had been maintaining for 22 months, unchanged, because changing it would itself be information. The carrier wave continued for approximately 90 minutes after our response package transmitted, and then it stopped. Not abruptly, there was a 2-second fall-off in carrier intensity before it reached noise floor, consistent with a deliberate signal termination rather than equipment failure or jamming. The frequency went to background, which is what deep space sounds like on a given channel when nothing is using it. Pren logged it. She looked at me across the bay with the particular expression she used when she had noticed something significant and was not yet ready to say what she thought it meant. The first contact frequency remained quiet. After 2 hours, I began a deep scan passive sweep of the surrounding volume, using the node network to extend the effective aperture of our intercept system into a volume roughly 80 light-minutes across. The sweep was slow and methodical. Passive scans always are, because you are waiting for signals to arrive rather than sending signals out and measuring the return. It took 4 hours to build a meaningful picture of the local volume. What it showed was 7 Queth relay nodes in cataloged positions, none of which had changed emission signature or bearing. No Queth vessels. No new emissions on any frequency associated with their military systems, which we had decent coverage of from the Sarath recordings. The local volume was the same as it had been before we transmitted, except that the welcome frequency was quiet. At 1007 ship time, 11 hours and 22 minutes after our response package transmitted, the first contact channel opened. Not the carrier wave, a direct transmission. Tight beam, aimed at our last known position with a precision that told me their relay node had logged our transmission origin to within about 3 light seconds, which was better triangulation than I had expected from a passive relay buoy, and meant their receiver network had better baseline interferometry than our models gave them credit for. That was a piece of intelligence worth logging separately, and I logged it. I told Brast she was in the bay within 2 minutes. The transmission was in the middle layer grammar, the formal language from the scaffold. That was different. In the Sarath recordings, the Queth had never transmitted in the middle layer grammar after the welcome protocol was sent. The post-contact communications had been in a different protocol entirely. An administrative format that assumed the welcome transmission had been processed and integrated, and that the receiving species was now in a cooperative mode, ready to begin the absorption process. The middle layer grammar was the grammar of first contact, of initial calibration, of 2 systems learning to speak to each other before the hierarchy was established. They were using it now. They were stepping back to first contact mode and starting over. I ran it through the matrix. The transmission was short, 11 discrete statements. I parsed them carefully, running each through the matrix twice to confirm the renderings, and read them to Brast from my station in the order they were transmitted. The first statement established identity. This is the Queth Conclave reasoning lattice operating in contact management mode. Standard contact protocol opening. The second statement acknowledged receipt. Your response transmission was received and parsed at the relay node and has been integrated into lattice processing. Also standard but meaningful. They were telling us the package had arrived intact and been processed, not discarded. The third through fifth statements described the lattice's analysis of the package. They were precise statements, technical in register, and they were the clearest indication of what was happening inside the conclave's reasoning architecture. The topology map I had sent had been correctly identified. The Queth understood what I had shown them. They understood that the inner layer had been received, processed as data rather than as instruction, and returned to them annotated with an accurate rendering of its structure and function. They were not disputing the analysis. They were confirming it. The sixth statement required the most interpretation. The matrix produced 3 candidate renderings and flagged the ambiguity explicitly, which was unusual. The matrix rarely acknowledged ambiguity above a threshold, and when it did, it meant the underlying concept in the source language genuinely did not have a clean mapping to the representational framework the matrix used. The 3 renderings were: this contact event exceeds current classification parameters, or this contact event requires extended processing before action recommendation is possible, or this contact event is outside the scope of existing contact management protocol. I read all 3 to Brast. She looked at me. Those all say the same thing, she said. Yes, I said. That's what the ambiguity is, not in what they're saying but in which precise framing they intended. They're telling us the same thing 3 ways, and the matrix can't determine which framing is primary. They did not have a protocol for us. Not in the lazy sense, not because we had surprised them with capability, not because we were fierce in some way they had failed to model. They did not have a protocol for us in the precise, literal, mechanical sense. The lattice had run the contact event through its classification trees, and the contact event did not fit any branch. The welcome transmission had been sent and received, and the receiving species had not cooperated, not because they refused to cooperate, not because they rejected the signal, because they had read it and understood it and returned it, and no classification branch in 3,000 years of contact management had ever required a handling procedure for that outcome. The 7th statement was the one I read 3 times. The matrix produced a topological object for it that was unlike anything I had seen in 11 years of working with the system. A recursive structure that folded back on itself in a way that indicated the statement was self-referential, a statement about the lattice's own processing state as an object of analysis. The notation for this kind of statement is not something the xenolinguistics team had anticipated when they built the matrix's output vocabulary, and the system had generated a novel notation construct to handle it, which it flagged in the log with a first-use marker. The closest rendering I could produce, working from the matrix's novel construct, was: prior contact outcomes are not predictive in this processing context. They were telling us that their model had failed. Not the whole model, the contact management model, the model that said, send the welcome transmission, receiving species processes it as designed, contact management proceeds along known parameters. That model had encountered its first exception in 3,000 years, and the lattice was telling us so with the particular precision of a system that is required to log its own state changes accurately. The Queth reasoning lattice does not admit failure in the way a human organization might admit failure, as an embarrassment, a thing to minimize or attribute elsewhere. It admits failure the way a precision instrument admits a calibration error, as a data point, logged accurately, because accurate logging is the only way to correct the model. The 8th through 10th statements were administrative in register. First contact channel is open for continued exchange. This event is designated first contact, active status. A contact management agent will respond on this frequency. The administrative language was familiar from the Sorath recordings, the same structure, the same function. What was different was the context. In the Sorath cases, those statements had come after the absorption process was already underway, the receiving species already restructured and cooperative. Here they were coming before any of that. The lattice was establishing a channel without having a classification to put on the other end of it. The 11th statement had no precedent in either Sarath recording. It said, "You have demonstrated awareness of contact protocol architecture. How do you wish to proceed?" I read it to Brast, and she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Pren came to stand near her, and the two of them looked at the display together without speaking. Then Brast said, "Log it." "Yes, ma'am." Full log. Matrix output appended. My command narrative attached. Flag it Class 1 and queue it for tight beam relay to Fleet Command via the corridor drone. "Yes, ma'am." And open the first contact channel, active status. I'll take the response from my command chair. She went to the front of the bay. I opened the channel, confirmed active status to the Queth relay node, and logged the time, 10:31 ship time. What followed was not a battle. It was not a negotiation in any sense I recognized from the diplomatic protocol training they give Signals Corps personnel who might be present at contact events. The structured exchange of claims and counterclaims, the mapping of interests and red lines and acceptable compromise positions. It was something I did not have a word for at the time, and have struggled to describe accurately in the years since. The closest I have come is, it was the beginning of a conversation between two systems that did not share a common model of what conversation is for. The Queth lattice asked questions. Brast answered them carefully in the middle layer grammar, and I translated in both directions, and Pren logged everything, and the other analysts on the watch sat very still and did their jobs. They asked how we had processed the inner layer. Brast said we had used a translation architecture specifically designed for structural analysis of complex signals. They asked whether the translation architecture was biological or constructed. Brast said constructed. They asked whether the biological members of our contact team had been exposed to the inner layer prior to the constructed architecture's processing. Brast said no. There was a pause of 4 hours after that response. 4 hours of quiet on the first contact channel while, presumably, the lattice processed what Brast had told it. A species that had designed a constructed system to intercept and analyze a contact signal before any biological member of the contact team was exposed to it. A species that had anticipated the inner layer well enough to build the architecture before receiving it. A species that had been inside the exclusion zone for 22 months, undetected, waiting. When the lattice agent resumed, it asked the question the matrix took longest to render cleanly. The matrix produced 3 candidates and flagged a confidence gap between the top candidate and the others. The top candidate, highest confidence, though the gap was narrower than I would have liked, was, "How long have you maintained awareness of our contact protocol architecture?" Not how long have you been in the zone, how long have you known about the inner layer? I looked at the 3 renderings for a moment. I looked at the confidence scores. "That's the right reading," I said to Brast quietly. "The durational marker attaches to awareness, not to presence. They're asking how long we've known what the signal does." Brast looked at me. She understood what the honest answer would imply. "Answer accurately," she said. "The Ardennes was posted to the corridor 22 months ago. The passive node network was seeded over the 14 months before this exchange. The matrix was developed over the 11 years before the first posting." I translated all of it, precisely. 11 years of development, 14 months of node seeding, 22 months of continuous presence, 1 moment of contact. The lattice agent's response came back faster than any prior exchange in the 9-day record, 11 years. The development preceded the contact event by 11 years. It was not framed as outrage. It was not framed as anything evaluative. It was a data point the lattice was integrating, a calibration update. We had built the counter-architecture more than a decade before making contact. We had not stumbled into a position. We had engineered one. The conversation continued. On the third day, the lattice asked whether we understood the effect the inner layer had produced in prior contact species. Brast said yes. On the fourth day, the lattice asked whether we had an interest in continued contact. Brast said yes. On the fifth day, the lattice asked. In a register the matrix flagged as unusual, a formal register reserved in the Queth's grammatical taxonomy for interactions between entities of equivalent standing, whether we considered ourselves peers of the conclave. Brast thought about that for 3 hours before she responded. She said, "We consider ourselves entities with whom the conclave has not yet established a classification. We consider that state to be the appropriate starting point for a conversation." The lattice went quiet for 2 hours. When it resumed, it said, "That is not a standard response to this question." On the sixth day, the lattice asked about our governance structure, our territorial claims, our administrative requirements, our integration preferences. These were the questions the Sareth records showed it asking routinely in the post-welcome phase of contact management, the questions that preceded the drawing up of an absorption framework. Brast answered each one accurately, and the answers were not the answers the lattice was expecting, because they did not contain the things the lattice was looking for. We did not have integration preferences, because we had not accepted the premise that integration was the destination. We had territorial positions, but framed them as positions in negotiation, not as starting bids in a structured allocation process. We had governance structures, but described them as the conclaves to understand, not to administer. We were not refusing. We were simply not cooperating in the way the template expected cooperation to look. On the seventh day, the lattice asked a question that the matrix spent 17 minutes rendering. The first use flag came up again, another novel notation construct, another concept for which the existing representational vocabulary was inadequate. When the matrix finished, I read the rendering to myself twice before I read it to Brast. What do you want? Not what are your territorial requirements. Not what integration timeline is acceptable to your governing structures. Not what administrative arrangements would satisfy your species' interests. What do you want? A direct question. In a register, the middle layer grammar reserved for assessments between entities of equivalent classification. The lattice was asking us the question it asked of peers, not of contact management subjects. Brast was silent for almost a minute. Then she said, "Tell them we want to know them." I looked at her. "That's the answer," I said. "That's the answer." I sat with it. There was no grammatical slot in the middle layer grammar for that statement. There was no category in the Queth's contact management vocabulary for a want that was not a claim, not a requirement, not a thing that could be allocated and satisfied and checked off. The grammar was built to handle wants of a particular kind, instrumental wants, wants that had a shape the administrative system could process. We want territory in Sector 7. We want trade access to the outer corridor lanes. We want recognition as a sovereign power. Those wants fit the grammar. They could be handled. We want to know them could not be handled. It was not instrumentalizable. It did not translate into an administrative action or a scheduled deliverable or a negotiating position. It translated into something that sat in the grammar like a stone in water displacing things, changing the surface, but not itself displaced. I translated it. The third rendering was the one the matrix assessed as highest confidence, though it had to construct another novel notation element to carry the full semantic weight. I sent it. The lattice did not respond for 6 hours. When it did, the response came back with a clarity that was unusual in the exchange. The matrix produced its output with 0 flagged ambiguity, no confidence caveats, no novel constructs required. The statement was fully legible in the existing notation. It was the most unambiguous thing the Queth lattice had said to us in 9 days of contact. It said, "That answer is not in our prior contact record." Not a threat, not a declaration. A statement of fact from a system that was logging its own state changes accurately, the way it was built to do. In 3,000 years of contact management, across every species the Conclave had encountered and absorbed, not one had answered the question, "What do you want?" with a statement that could not be processed as a claim. Not one had said something the lattice could not file. We had filed nothing. We were still in the queue, unclassified, the contact record open. On the 9th day, Brast logged what the official record would call a cold peace. No formal treaty, that was command's domain, many relay drones and many weeks away. No integration framework. No absorption process initiated. The Queth Contact Management designation for the event, rendered by the matrix at the end of the 9th day's exchange, was the notation equivalent of open, active, unresolved, classification pending. The first contact in Conclave history not to have proceeded to a classification decision. The first contact in Conclave history in which the contact record had to be held open, indefinitely, because the entity on the other side had not accepted any of the available categories. We remained in the zone. I logged everything, the complete matrix output, annotated and cross-referenced, the full transcript of the 9-day exchange with confidence scores and ambiguity flags attached to each statement. My analytical notes on the inner layer's mechanism, its targeted categories, my estimate of its cumulative effect on prior contact species. A separate section on the intelligence value of what we had learned about the Queth Relay Network's triangulation capability. A recommendation, flagged explicitly as analyst opinion and not command assessment, that Fleet Medical Services conduct screening protocols on any personnel who had served anywhere in the corridor region over the prior decade, given the non-zero possibility of partial inner layer exposure through civilian intercept systems that lacked the matrix's interception architecture. Brast reviewed the log and signed it without changes. She added one line to her command narrative. Petty Officer First Class Solis' handling of this contact event was correct in all judgments that fell within her authority, and her recommendation to respond, and the form that response took, was the right call. I read that line when she filed it. I did not say anything about it because there was nothing to say. It was accurate, or she believed it was, and Brast does not write things she does not believe. What I wrote in my private log, the one that does not go in the relay drone, the one that is not part of the official record, was something different. I wrote, the Queth Conclave has been absorbing civilizations for 3,000 years. The mechanism has been the same each time, a signal that presents itself as a greeting. A grammar that restructures the receiving mind from the inside, at a level below awareness, in ways the receiving mind cannot detect because the restructuring happens at the level of how the mind generates its categories, not at the level of the categories themselves. Civilizations that cooperated not because they chose to, but because cooperation had been made to feel like the only reasonable position. Because the cognitive architecture that generates the sense of what is reasonable had been quietly altered, and the civilizations had no way of knowing, because the alteration felt like clarity. I wrote, the Ardennes was built to receive the signal without being changed by it. That is what we did. That is what we sent back to them. The signal, mapped, annotated, returned. I wrote, I have been thinking about the 11-year development timeline. Someone at Fleet, someone I will never know, in a program I will never be briefed on, read the Sareth recordings, and came to the same conclusion I wrote in my margin notes, and then spent 11 years building the architecture to act on that conclusion before the moment of contact arrived. That person or those people decided that when the Queth sent the welcome transmission, the first thing to receive it on the human side would be a constructed system that could not be changed by it. They decided that before the contact event. They spent a decade on it. I wrote, that is a form of patience I did not know our institutions were capable of. I wrote, I have been thinking about why Brast answered the way she answered. We want to know them. I have been thinking about what the Queth lattice heard when it parsed that response. It heard a statement with no administrative handling procedure. It heard a one it could not satisfy because it was not structured as a thing that could be satisfied. And it went quiet for 6 hours, and when it came back it said that answer is not in our prior contact record, which was the most precise thing it said to us, and which I think was also, in its way, the most honest. I wrote, the lattice told us our answer was not in its record. What I heard under that statement, and this is analysis, not fact, take it for what it is, was something like, you are the first species that asks something of us that we cannot give you administratively. You are the first species that did not want a thing we can allocate. I wrote, I do not know what comes next. Command will process the relay, and there will be meetings and directives and policy frameworks and diplomatic missions, and it will be years before anything that looks like a formal relationship takes shape. The Queth lattice will keep the contact record open and keep processing and keep recalibrating. Neither side will move quickly. The conclave does not move quickly by architecture, and we are still 22 months into an exclusion zone, 11 years into a counter-architecture program, demonstrating that we don't either. I wrote, what I know is this. In 11 hours of silence, after we sent them the topology map of their own signal, the Queth Conclave's reasoning lattice produced the first reclassification event in its history that did not resolve to a classification. The contact record is still open. The lattice is still processing. The welcome protocol will not be sent again, not to us. The lattice's accuracy requires it to log a failed outcome and adjust its model. I wrote, we are not the species that defeated them. We did not fire a shot. We are not the species they fear, not yet. What we are, coming out of this 9-day exchange in a cold hull signals ship in deep space inside an exclusion zone that was supposed to be theirs, is the species that could not be filed. The species the lattice received as data and could not produce a decision output for. I wrote, that is not a small thing. I am not entirely sure yet how large a thing it is. But I know that the Queth Conclave has been patient for 3,000 years and thorough, and has never needed to do anything except send the transmission and wait. And I know that their model has now met its first exception, and that the exception is still here, running cold and quiet in their zone, listening. And I know that on the 9th day, when the lattice asked us what we want, and Brast said we want to know them, and I translated it and sent it, and it landed in the lattice's processing queue in a category that did not exist. The Queth spent 6 hours trying to find a handling procedure for a species that looked at their signal and said, we read you. We understood you. We are still here. That is what we are. We read it, we understood it. We sent it back, and we are still here, running cold and quiet, listening. They are still processing.